The summer of 1878 had been merciless to the territory of New Mexico. The sun blazed down upon the dusty settlement of Socorro like the breath of an angry spirit, turning the adobe walls into ovens and the wooden boardwalks into platforms of scorching misery. Sarah McKenna pressed her weathered palm against the small window of her modest home, watching the heat waves dance above the desert floor like ghostly apparitions. Her husband's grave marker stood solitary in the small cemetery beyond the town's edge, a constant reminder of the cholera outbreak that had claimed so many lives just 3 months prior. At 34, Sarah had already buried a husband and 2 infant children. Her hands, once soft from a privileged upbringing in Boston, now bore the calluses and scars of frontier survival. The elaborate dresses she had brought west in her trousseau had long since been traded for practical cotton and wool garments that could withstand the harsh demands of territorial life. Her auburn hair, once carefully arranged in fashionable styles, was now pulled back in a simple bun, secured with pins carved from buffalo bone, a gift from a traveling merchant who had taken pity on her widowed state. The sound of approaching horses drew her attention to the main street. A cavalry patrol was riding into town, their blue uniforms dusty and their faces grim beneath the brims of their campaign hats. Captain James Morrison led the column, his weathered features set in the permanent scowl that had become his trademark during his 15 years of frontier service. Behind him rode Lieutenant Thomas Brennan, young and eager, his uniform still relatively clean despite the long patrol. The remaining 8 soldiers looked tired and worn, their horses moving with the mechanical gait of animals pushed to their limits. Sarah recognized the signs immediately. Another Apache raid had occurred somewhere in the territory, and the cavalry was once again preparing for what the newspapers back east romantically called Indian fighting, but what the people of the frontier knew as brutal, desperate warfare between 2 peoples fighting for survival on the same patch of unforgiving land. Captain Morrison dismounted in front of the general store and handed his reins to one of his men. His spurs clinked against the wooden steps as he climbed to the boardwalk, and Sarah could see Mrs. Henderson, the storekeeper's wife, emerge from the shadows of the store's interior with the look of someone bracing for bad news. The captain's voice carried across the still air as he began to speak, and Sarah strained to catch his words. "Another homestead hit," Morrison was saying, his voice rough from years of shouting orders over desert winds and gunfire. "The Patterson place, about 20 miles north of here, family of 4. The father and oldest boy put up a fight, but—" He left the sentence hanging, and Mrs. Henderson's hand flew to her throat. "What about Martha Patterson and little Emma?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Morrison shook his head slowly. "Took them. Trailheads northwest toward the Mescalero country. We're organizing a pursuit, but we'll need supplies and fresh horses. The Apache have at least a 6-hour head start, maybe more." Sarah felt a familiar knot of dread form in her stomach. She had heard this story too many times before, and she knew how it usually ended. The cavalry would follow the trail until it grew cold or led them into terrain too dangerous to navigate with horses and supply wagons. The captured women and children would disappear into the vast wilderness of the Apache homeland, becoming either adopted members of the tribe if they were fortunate, or casualties of a conflict that seemed to have no end and no winners. As Morrison and his men began the process of requisitioning supplies from the reluctant townspeople, Sarah made a decision that would change the course of her life forever. She had skills that the cavalry needed, skills that her late husband had taught her during their early years on the frontier. Daniel McKenna had been a scout and tracker before settling down to try his hand at ranching, and he had passed on his knowledge to his wife during the long evenings when Apache raids made it too dangerous to venture far from their homestead. Sarah gathered her courage and crossed the street, her worn boots clicking against the sun-baked earth. The soldiers looked up as she approached, their expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism. Captain Morrison turned to face her, his steel-gray eyes taking in her appearance with the automatic assessment of a career military man. "Ma'am, he said with a slight nod, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture of courtesy that was as automatic as breathing for men of his generation and profession. "Captain Morrison," Sarah replied, matching his formal tone despite the racing of her heart. "I couldn't help but overhear about the Patterson family. I'd like to volunteer my services for the pursuit." The silence that followed her words was so complete that Sarah could hear the buzz of flies around the horse trough and the creak of the wooden sign hanging above the saloon. Lieutenant Brennan's eyebrows shot up in surprise, while several of the enlisted men exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their opinion of women who involved themselves in military matters. Morrison's expression didn't change, but Sarah caught a flicker of something in his eyes that might have been interest. "What services would those be, Mrs. McKenna?" "Tracking," Sarah replied simply. "My husband taught me to read sign, follow trails, and move quietly through Apache country. I know their methods, their preferred routes, and their seasonal patterns. More importantly, I speak enough Apache to serve as an interpreter if negotiations become necessary." This last statement caused a visible stir among the soldiers. Few white settlers had ever bothered to learn the Apache language, considering it either unnecessary or beneath their dignity. Those who did possess such knowledge were usually traders, missionaries, or old-timers who had learned it through years of contact with peaceful Apache bands. Morrison studied Sarah's face for a long moment, his experienced eyes searching for any sign of hysteria or romantic notions about frontier adventure. What he saw instead was the steady gaze of a woman who had been tested by loss and hardship and had emerged stronger rather than broken. "The Apache Trail will be hard to follow," he said finally. "It'll mean long days in the saddle, short rations, and sleeping on the ground in country where every shadow might hide a warrior with a rifle. This isn't a job for someone looking to prove a point or settle a score." Sarah met his gaze without flinching. "Captain, I've been living in Apache country for 8 years. I've survived raids, drought, disease, and isolation. I buried my husband and children in soil that drinks blood as readily as rainwater. I'm not looking to prove anything or settle any scores. I'm looking to save Martha Patterson and her daughter before they disappear forever into a wilderness that most of your men have never seen except from the back of a cavalry horse." The truth in her words seemed to resonate with Morrison, and Sarah could see the calculation happening behind his weathered features. He was a practical man who understood that successful campaigns required every available advantage, regardless of the source. The Apache were masters of their desert domain, and tracking them through their own territory required skills that most cavalry troopers, trained for conventional warfare on European battlefields, simply didn't possess. "You have a horse?" he asked finally. "A good one. A Mustang mare with Apache breeding. She can travel all day on half rations and make less noise than a whisper." Morrison nodded slowly. "Equipment: rifle, sidearm, field gear, and enough supplies for a week in the desert. I can be ready in 30 minutes. The captain turned to Lieutenant Brennan, who had been listening to the exchange with growing amazement. "Tom, what's your assessment?" The young officer cleared his throat nervously. "Sir, regulations clearly state that civilians, especially female civilians, are not authorized to accompany military expeditions into hostile territory." Morrison's smile was grim. "Lieutenant, regulations were written by men who've never tried to track Apache through country that changes faster than a woman changes her mind about a hat. Mrs. McKenna, you have 15 minutes to gather your gear. We ride at noon." As Sarah hurried back to her house to prepare, she couldn't help but notice the mixture of expressions on the faces of the townspeople who had witnessed the exchange. Some looked shocked at her boldness, others appeared concerned for her safety, and a few seemed to regard her with the kind of suspicion reserved for women who stepped too far outside the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Mrs. Henderson intercepted her at the door of her house, her round face flushed with concern and disapproval. "Sarah McKenna, have you lost your mind? Riding off into the desert with a bunch of soldiers, chasing after Apache Indians like some kind of what, Gladys?" Sarah asked quietly, her hand resting on the door handle. The older woman struggled to find words that would express her shock without crossing the lines of propriety. It's not what decent women do, Sarah. What will people think?" Sarah turned to face her neighbor fully, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of experiences that Mrs. Henderson, for all her years on the frontier, had never faced. "Gladys, Martha Patterson is probably tied to a horse right now, riding toward a fate that you and I can't even imagine. Her little girl Emma is crying for her father, who's lying dead in his own dooryard with Apache arrows in his chest. In a week, maybe less, they'll both be so far from civilization that we'll never see them again. If riding with Captain Morrison's patrol means there's even a chance of bringing them home, then I don't much care what decent people think." The force of her words left Mrs. Henderson speechless, and Sarah used the moment of silence to slip into her house and begin her preparations. The interior was sparse but clean, reflecting both her reduced circumstances and her practical nature. A photograph of her late husband sat on the mantelpiece, his serious face staring out from beneath the brim of a cavalry hat he had worn during his own military service years before. Sarah moved through her preparations with the efficiency of someone who had done this before, though never under such circumstances. She pulled a leather satchel from beneath her bed and began filling it with items that experience had taught her were essential for extended travel in hostile territory. Jerked beef, hardtack, coffee, salt, a small sewing kit, extra ammunition for her weapons, a water purification powder that a cavalry doctor had given her, and a small leather pouch containing herbs and remedies that Apache women had taught her during the brief periods of peace between the raids. Her rifle was a Winchester Model 1873, chambered for the same, 4440, cartridge as her Colt Peacemaker revolver, a matching set that Daniel had insisted upon for the practical advantage of carrying only one type of ammunition. Both weapons were meticulously maintained, their metal surfaces showing the kind of care that meant the difference between life and death in a country where mechanical failure could be fatal. Sarah changed into her traveling clothes, heavy cotton trousers that she had modified from a pair of Daniel's old work pants, a loose-fitting shirt that would breathe in the desert heat, and a leather vest with numerous pockets for carrying small necessities. Her boots were Apache-made moccasins that came up to mid-calf, traded for a bolt of calico cloth during one of the peaceful interludes that occasionally interrupted the cycle of raid and retaliation. They were silent on rocky ground and comfortable for long periods in the saddle. As she prepared to leave, Sarah paused before the photograph of her husband. "I hope I'm doing the right thing, Daniel," she whispered to the image. "I hope you'd understand." The sound of horses moving outside told her that Captain Morrison was making good on his promise to depart at noon. Sarah slung her rifle across her back, settled her satchel and bedroll behind her saddle, and led her mare from the small stable behind her house. The horse was indeed a beauty, her coat the color of desert sand with darker markings that seemed to shift and change in different light. Sarah had named her Whisper, both for her silent movement and for the way she seemed to communicate with her rider through subtle shifts of muscle and breath, rather than overt gestures. The patrol was already mounted when Sarah emerged, and she could see that Morrison had added 2 additional men to his original force. A grizzled sergeant named Murphy, who looked old enough to have fought in the Civil War, and a young trooper whose nervous energy suggested this might be his first real action against hostile Indians. The pack animals were loaded with supplies for an extended pursuit, and Sarah noticed with approval that Morrison had included extra water and horse feed, suggesting that he understood the challenges they would face in the desert country ahead. As Sarah mounted Whisper and took her place at the edge of the formation, she became aware of the attention she was drawing from the townspeople who had gathered to watch the patrol's departure. Some faces showed concern, others curiosity, and more than a few displayed the kind of disapproval that Mrs. Henderson had voiced more directly. Sarah realized that regardless of the outcome of their mission, her decision to join the patrol would mark a permanent change in how she was perceived by her community. Captain Morrison walked his horse to the center of the group and turned to address his men. "Gentlemen, we're pursuing a war party that has at least 6 hours head start on us. They're moving fast and they know this country better than we do. Our only advantages are superior firepower and the tracking skills of our civilian guide." He nodded toward Sarah. "Mrs. McKenna will be taking point once we pick up the trail. She's lived in this territory longer than most of us, and she knows Apache tactics and movement patterns. Any man who has a problem with that arrangement is free to remain behind." Sarah appreciated the captain's matter-of-fact approach to her inclusion in the patrol. By presenting her as a practical necessity rather than an unusual circumstance, he had forestalled much of the resistance she might have encountered from his men. Still, she could see the doubt in several pairs of eyes, and she knew that she would have to prove herself through actions rather than words. The patrol moved out of Socorro at a steady trot, heading north toward the Patterson homestead. The sun was already high enough to make the air shimmer with heat waves, and Sarah pulled her hat down low to shade her eyes as she scanned the horizon for any sign of movement. The landscape ahead was classic high desert, scattered patches of scrub brush and cactus, separated by stretches of bare earth and exposed rock, all of it painted in shades of brown and gold that seemed to absorb and reflect the brutal sunlight. As they rode, Sarah found herself thinking about Martha Patterson and her daughter Emma. She had met them only a few times at church services and town social gatherings, but she remembered Martha as a quiet, hard-working woman who had seemed to be adapting well to frontier life despite the challenges. Emma had been a bright, curious child of perhaps 8 or 9 years, with her mother's dark hair and her father's quick smile. The thought of what they might be enduring at this moment made Sarah's stomach tighten with a mixture of determination and dread. The Patterson homestead, when they reached it, told the story of the attack with brutal clarity. The house still stood, but the front door hung open on broken hinges and the windows had been shattered by rifle fire. Scattered around the yard were the remnants of a family's attempt to build a life in an unforgiving land. Broken furniture, torn clothing, scattered household goods that spoke of lives interrupted in the most violent possible way. Tom Patterson's body lay where he had fallen near the front steps, 3 Apache arrows protruding from his chest and back. His son, barely 16, had made it perhaps 20 yards from the house before being cut down by rifle fire. Both bodies showed signs of mutilation that Sarah forced herself to examine with clinical detachment, knowing that such details might provide clues about which Apache band was responsible for the raid. Captain Morrison dismounted and walked slowly around the scene, his experienced eyes taking in details that might escape a less trained observer. Lieutenant Brennan remained mounted, his face pale as he stared at the carnage. Several of the enlisted men muttered prayers or curses under their breath, while Sergeant Murphy began the grim task of examining the bodies for any information that might aid in their pursuit. Sarah studied the ground around the house with the focused attention that Daniel had taught her. The story written in the dust and scattered debris was one she had learned to read through years of living on the edge of Apache territory. The attack had come at dawn. When the family would have been preparing for the day's work, the raiders had approached from the east, using the rising sun to mask their advance until they were close enough to ensure that escape would be impossible. "How many?" Morrison asked, appearing at Sarah's shoulder as she knelt beside a clear set of moccasin prints in the dust near the well. 12, maybe 15 warriors," she replied without looking up. "They came fast and hit hard. No time for the family to organize any real defense." "Any indication which band?" Sarah pointed to a distinctive arrow that had lodged in the wooden frame of the front door. The shaft was painted with red and black stripes in a pattern that she recognized from previous encounters. "Mescalero, most likely from Nana's band. See the arrow markings? That's their signature." Morrison nodded grimly. Nana was one of the most feared Apache war leaders still active, an elderly warrior whose age had not diminished his tactical brilliance or his hatred for the white settlers who had invaded his people's traditional hunting grounds. If Nana was leading this raid, it meant that the pursuit would be even more dangerous and difficult than originally anticipated. "Trail?" Morrison asked. Sarah rose and pointed toward the northwest, where the desert floor rose gradually toward a line of low hills that marked the beginning of the more rugged country where the Apache felt most at home. They headed that way, moving fast, probably switched horses at least once since the raid. "If we push hard, we might catch sight of them by nightfall, but we'll be getting into country where they have every advantage." Morrison called his men together and gave orders for the burial of the Patterson men. It was grim work in the blazing heat, but necessary both for reasons of decency and to prevent the bodies from attracting scavengers that might complicate their pursuit. As the soldiers worked with picks and shovels, Sarah continued her examination of the scene, looking for any additional clues that might help them anticipate the raiders' route or intentions. What she found troubled her. Mixed in with the moccasin prints were the tracks of unshod horses moving at a gallop, more horses than would have been needed to mount the raiding party. This suggested that the Apache had planned not just a quick strike for captives and plunder, but possibly a longer campaign involving multiple targets. If that was the case, Martha Patterson and her daughter might be just the first of several families to disappear into the desert wilderness. By the time the bodies were buried and the patrol was ready to resume the pursuit, the sun had moved well past its zenith and the afternoon heat was becoming almost unbearable. Sarah led the way now, following the trail left by the Apache war party with a skill that gradually earned the respect of even the most skeptical soldiers. She moved ahead of the main group by perhaps 100 yards, reading the signs left in sand and stone, while the cavalry followed at a pace that balanced speed with the need to preserve their horses' strength for the long pursuit ahead. The trail led through increasingly difficult terrain as the hours passed. What had begun as relatively easy travel across flat desert gradually gave way to broken country filled with arroyos, rocky outcroppings, and patches of thorny vegetation that seemed designed to snag clothing and tear at exposed skin. The Apache had chosen their route well, following paths that would slow down pursuing cavalry while offering numerous opportunities for ambush if the war party chose to turn and fight. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Sarah called a halt at the edge of a deep arroyo that cut across their path like a wound in the earth. The trail disappeared over the opposite rim, but something about the way it ended troubled her. She dismounted and approached the edge carefully, studying the ground with the intensity of someone whose life might depend on reading the story written in dust and stone. "What is it?" Morrison asked, riding up beside her. "They split up here," Sarah replied, pointing to the confusing maze of tracks at the arroyo's edge. "Part of the group went down into the wash and followed it west. The rest went over the rim and continued north." "Which group has the women?" Sarah studied the tracks more closely, looking for signs that would indicate the presence of captives. After several minutes, she pointed to a set of smaller footprints that seemed to have been made by someone walking rather than riding. "The northern group. See these tracks? That's Martha Patterson, and she's on foot. They're making her walk to slow down any pursuit." Morrison's expression darkened. Making captives walk was a common Apache tactic that served multiple purposes. It slowed down the war party's movement, making it easier for pursuing cavalry to catch up, but it also exhausted the captives and made escape attempts less likely. More ominously, it often indicated that the raiders were not in a hurry to reach safety, suggesting that they might have additional objectives beyond the simple capture of prisoners. "How far behind are we?" Morrison asked. Sarah examined the freshness of the tracks, noting details like the sharpness of hoofprints in sand and the way disturbed vegetation had begun to recover from being trampled. 3 hours, maybe 4. We're gaining on them, but slowly. The captain made the decision to continue the pursuit despite the approaching darkness. Apache warriors were notorious for their ability to travel at night through terrain that would stop most cavalry units, and any delay might allow the war party to increase their lead beyond recovery. The patrol resumed its advance, now following the northern trail toward country that none of the soldiers had ever seen and few white men had ever explored. As darkness fell across the desert, the pursuit took on an almost dreamlike quality. Sarah continued to follow the trail by starlight and the occasional flash of a shielded lantern, her years of experience allowing her to read signs that were invisible to the soldiers behind her. The Apache had not bothered to conceal their passage, apparently confident that the difficult terrain and their head start would be sufficient to discourage pursuit. Around midnight, Sarah called another halt. The trail had led them to the base of a steep-sided mesa that rose from the desert floor like a sleeping giant. Even in the darkness, she could see that the Apache had taken their captives up a narrow path that switchbacked across the mesa's face, a route that would be extremely dangerous for mounted men in daylight and potentially suicidal in darkness. Morrison studied the path with the aid of his lantern, noting the loose rock and narrow ledges that made up the route. "Can we follow them up there?" "Not at night," Sarah replied. "Not unless we want to lose horses and men to falls. But there's something else. Look at the trail." She led him to a spot where the tracks were particularly clear in a patch of sand at the mesa's base. "They stopped here for some time. See how the horse droppings are piled up? And look at this." Sarah pointed to a series of marks in the sand that looked almost like symbols or letters. Morrison examined them closely, but couldn't make sense of the patterns. "Apache writing?" he asked. "No. Martha Patterson made these marks. She's trying to leave us messages." Sarah's heart raced as she realized what the marks represented. Martha Patterson was not just a passive victim being dragged toward an unknown fate. She was actively trying to help her rescuers, leaving signs that indicated her location and condition despite the enormous risk such actions represented. If the Apache discovered what she was doing, the consequences would be swift and brutal. "What do they say?" Sarah studied the marks more carefully, trying to decipher their meaning. After several minutes, she began to make out a pattern. "Emma sick. Going up. Help." The simple message contained a wealth of information. Emma Patterson was ill, possibly from the trauma of witnessing her father's and brother's deaths, or perhaps from the physical demands of the forced march. The Apache had indeed taken their captives up the mesa, confirming what the trail already suggested, and Martha Patterson was still thinking clearly enough to leave messages for potential rescuers, indicating that she had not yet given up hope of rescue. Morrison gathered his men around him for a quick conference. The situation had become more complex and dangerous with each passing hour. The Apache were leading them into increasingly difficult country where the advantages of cavalry mobility and firepower would be largely negated. The captives were in distress, making any rescue attempt more urgent but also more complicated. And somewhere above them, in the darkness of the mesa's heights, an unknown number of Apache warriors were preparing for whatever came next. "Sir," Lieutenant Brennan spoke up during a lull in the discussion, "perhaps we should send a rider back to Socorro for reinforcements. If we're going up against Nana's entire band, by the time reinforcements could reach us, the trail would be cold and the captives would be long gone." Morrison replied, "No. We continue with what we have. At first light, we go up that trail." Sarah listened to the exchange with growing unease. She understood the captain's reasoning, but she also knew that the Apache had not chosen this route randomly. The mesa above them was perfect defensive terrain, offering multiple positions from which a small force could hold off a much larger one. If Nana's warriors chose to make a stand, the cavalry patrol might find itself trapped on the narrow trail with no room to maneuver and no possibility of retreat. As the men prepared to spend the remainder of the night in a cold camp at the base of the mesa, Sarah found herself staring up at the rocky walls that rose into the darkness above them. Somewhere up there, Martha and Emma Patterson were enduring hardships that she could only imagine, while Apache warriors prepared for the battle that would likely come with the dawn. The thought that had been nagging at her throughout the pursuit suddenly crystallized into certainty. This was not a simple raid for captives and plunder. The Apache were leading them somewhere specific, towards some predetermined objective that went beyond the mere capture of two white women. The question was whether Captain Morrison and his small patrol were walking into a trap, or whether they were being drawn toward something even more dangerous. As Sarah settled down for what little sleep the night might offer, wrapped in her blanket beside the dying coals of their carefully concealed fire, she found herself thinking about the long chain of events that had brought her to this moment. The death of her husband, the isolation of widowhood, the decision to volunteer for this dangerous mission. All of it seemed to have been leading toward whatever would happen when the sun rose over the mesa and the final phase of the pursuit began. The desert night was filled with sounds that most people never heard. The rustle of small animals moving through the brush, the distant howl of coyotes, the whisper of wind through stone formations that had stood since before human beings first walked this land. But underlying all of these natural sounds was something else, something that Sarah's trained ear could detect, even when the soldiers around her remained oblivious to its presence. The Apache were singing. The sound was so faint that it might have been mistaken for wind, but Sarah knew better. Somewhere above them, in the hidden places of the mesa, Apache warriors were conducting the rituals that traditionally preceded battle. The songs were ancient, passed down through generations of fighters who had learned that courage in combat came not from the absence of fear, but from the proper spiritual preparation for the possibility of death. The realization that the Apache were preparing for battle rather than continuing their flight changed everything. It meant that Martha and Emma Patterson were no longer simply captives being taken deeper into Apache territory. They had become the bait in a trap that was about to close around Captain Morrison's small patrol. Sarah lay in the darkness, listening to the distant songs and considering her options. She could wake Morrison and warn him of what she had discovered, but would he believe her? The singing was so faint that he might dismiss it as imagination or the product of overwrought nerves. She could try to convince him to withdraw and wait for reinforcements, but that would almost certainly mean abandoning the Patterson women to whatever fate the Apache had planned for them. Or she could wait until dawn and hope that when the battle came, her skills and knowledge would be enough to tip the balance in favor of the cavalry patrol. As the night wore on and the Apache songs continued their ancient rhythm above the sleeping soldiers, Sarah McKenna made peace with the choice she had already made when she volunteered to join the pursuit. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought, and she would face it with the same determination that had carried her through the loss of her husband and children, through years of isolation on the frontier, and through all the other trials that had shaped her into the woman she had become. The first pale light of dawn was beginning to show above the eastern horizon when Sarah finally allowed herself to drift into the light, restless sleep of someone who knows that the new day will demand everything she has to give.